The courtroom buzzed with a restless hum as spectators shuffled into the wooden pews, their whispers weaving a tapestry of anticipation. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, her sharp suit a stark contrast to the chaos around her, her posture rigid with purpose. She adjusted the stack of files on the prosecution table, her fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another case. It was a battle against corruption that ran deep, a tangled web spun by a wealthy developer named Victor Grayson, whose shadow loomed over the city like a storm cloud. Today she'd face him head-on, armed with evidence that could topple his empire. But then the gavel cracked like thunder, silencing the room. Judge Howard Gates swept in, his black robe billowing as he climbed the bench, his face carved with disdain. He was no stranger to power, a man whose rulings often bent suspiciously in favor of the elite. His dark eyes flicked toward Bondi, narrowing, as if sizing up prey. She met his gaze, unflinching, her jaw tight. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "Counselor Bondi," he began, his voice dripping with mockery, "I trust you've brought something more than your usual theatrics today." A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. The insult landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. Bondi's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse, she told herself, though the sting lingered. The judge leaned forward, a smirk tugging at his lips. "This is a courtroom, not a stage for your little crusades." The spectators shifted uncomfortably, sensing the hostility. Grayson, seated at the defense table, adjusted his tie, his expression smug. He knew Gates, trusted him, perhaps too much. Bondi straightened, her voice cutting through the silence. "Your Honor, I'm here to present evidence, not to entertain you." Her tone was ice, controlled but edged with defiance. Gates raised, an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. As the hearing began, Bondi outlined the case. Grayson's company had funneled millions into offshore accounts, bribing officials to secure permits for a luxury high-rise, all while displacing hundreds of families. She spoke with precision, her words painting a damning picture. But Gates interrupted, his interruptions growing sharper, more personal. "Spare us the sob stories, Counselor," he snapped. "Stick to the facts, if you can manage that." The room tensed. Bondi's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. She wouldn't let him rattle her, not yet. She pressed on, detailing forged documents, intercepted emails, a trail of greed. But with every sentence, Gates seemed to grow more restless, his interruptions more biting. "This is a waste of the court's time," he barked, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You're out of your depth, Ms. Bondi." The words hung heavy, a public dressing down meant to humiliate. The gallery held its breath, waiting for her response. Bondi paused, her eyes locking with Gates. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down. "We'll see who's out of their depth, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice steady as steel. The judge's smirk faltered, just for a moment, and in that flicker, the real battle began. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Pam Bondi opened her briefcase, pulling out a thick binder labeled Exhibit A. The courtroom's tension thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on every soul in the room. She approached the witness, stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a declaration of intent. Judge Gates watched her, his fingers drumming impatiently on the bench, his earlier insults still echoing in the air. He thought he'd thrown her off balance, but Bondi was a storm gathering strength. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. Gates waved a hand dismissively. "Get on with it, then. I'm not here to babysit your case." The jab was petty, but it stung. The gallery murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting. Uncomfortably, Bondi ignored it, motioning to a nervous-looking man in a gray suit. Daniel Pierce, a former accountant for Grayson's company. Pierce took the stand, his hands trembling as he swore the oath. Bondi stood before him, her presence calm but commanding. "Mr. Pierce," she began, "tell the court what you discovered in Victor Grayson's financial records." Pierce swallowed hard, glancing at Grayson, whose icy stare could have frozen fire. "I found discrepancies," he stammered. "Millions moved through shell companies, payments to city officials, all hidden in the books." The room erupted, in whispers. Bondi handed Pierce a stack of printouts, bank statements stamped with Grayson's logo. "Is this your work?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, I traced every dollar." She turned to the judge. "Permission to enter this into evidence?" Gates leaned back, his expression sour. "Fine," he grunted. "But don't expect me to be impressed by your paper trail." Bondi didn't react. She didn't need to. She moved to her next exhibit, a series of emails between Grayson and a city council member promising kickbacks for a zoning change. She read them aloud, her voice rising with each damning word. The gallery leaned forward, captivated, as Grayson's composure began to crack, his fingers tightening around his pen. But Gates wasn't having it. "Enough," he snapped, slamming his gavel. "This is speculation dressed up as fact. You're fishing, counselor, and I won't indulge it." Bondi's eyes flashed, but she kept her tone even. "This is evidence, Your Honor, not speculation. The court deserves to hear it." Gates glared, his patience fraying. "The court deserves a prosecutor who knows her place," he shot back, his words venomous. A hush fell. Bondi stood frozen for a heartbeat, the insult ringing in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her to crack, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "My place," she said softly, "is to uphold justice, something you might want to remember." The gallery gasped, a few spectators exchanging wide-eyed glances. Gates' face darkened, his knuckles whitening around the gavel. He thought he could silence her, break her with his authority. But Bondi was relentless. She turned back to Pierce. "One more question," she said. "Did anyone else know about these payments?" Pierce hesitated, then whispered, "Yes, someone high up, someone with influence." Bondi pressed. "Who?" Pierce's voice barely carried. "I don't know. They used a code name, Shadow." The word hung in the air, a ghost of a clue. Bondi stepped back, her mind racing. Shadow. She glanced at Gates, his expression unreadable, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tightening. She filed it away, a piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The judge might have thought he'd won this round, but Bondi was just getting started. The courtroom clock ticked relentlessly, each second amplifying the growing unease. Pam Bondi stood at the prosecution table, her notes spread before her like a battlefield map, every line a weapon in her arsenal. She'd already landed blows. Grayson's accountant had cracked under her questioning, revealing a cesspool of corruption. But Judge Gates loomed over the proceedings, his shadow stretching far beyond the bench, his disdain for Bondi now a living thing, palpable and fierce. She called her next witness, Maria Torres, a single mother displaced by Grayson's high-rise project. Torres took the stand, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting toward the developer. Bondi approached, her voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Torres, tell us what happened when Grayson's company took your home." Torres' voice trembled as she spoke. "They gave us 2 weeks to leave, said it was progress, but I saw men in suits handing envelopes to officials. I heard them laugh about it." The gallery stirred, a wave of sympathy rippling through. Bondi handed Torres a photo, a grainy shot, of Grayson shaking hands with a councilman outside her old apartment. "Is this what you saw?" Torres nodded, tears brimming. "Yes, that's him." Bondi turned to the judge. "Exhibit B, Your Honor." Gates barely glanced at it. "Sentimental nonsense," he muttered loud enough for all to hear. "This isn't a soap opera, counselor." Bondi's jaw tightened, but she pressed on, her voice rising. This is about people losing everything to greed, Your Honor. It's the heart of this case. Gates leaned forward, his eyes cold. The heart of this case is your inability to stick to the law, Ms. Bondi, not these sob stories. The gallery bristled, a few spectators muttering in protest. Bondi's composure held, but inside, anger simmered. He wasn't just dismissing her evidence, he was dismissing her. She pivoted, calling an expert forensic accountant to tie Torres's story to the financial trail. The expert, a wiry man named Dr. Ellis, laid out spreadsheets showing how Grayson's bribes funded evictions. "Every dollar matches," Ellis said, pointing to the data. "It's airtight." Bondi watched the jury, their faces hardening, as the truth sank in. Grayson shifted in his seat, his confidence fraying. But Gates intervened again. "This is tedious," he barked, cutting Ellis off. "We get it. Numbers on a page. Move along." Bondi spun toward him, her patience thinning. "Your Honor, this establishes motive and method. It's critical." Gates smirked, a cruel edge to it. "Critical to your ego, perhaps, not this court." The insult was a dagger, public and precise. Bondi's hands balled into fists at her sides, but she unclenched them, forcing calm. Then it happened, a slip so subtle it nearly went unnoticed. As Bondi handed the spreadsheets to the clerk, Gates muttered under his breath, "Grayson's too smart for this." The room froze. Bondi's head snapped up, her eyes locking with his. "What did you say, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous. Gates blinked, caught off guard, then waved it away. "Nothing. Proceed." But it wasn't nothing. The gallery buzzed, heads turning. Grayson's attorney coughed nervously, sensing the shift. Bondi stepped closer to the bench, her stare piercing. "It sounded like you're defending the defendant," she said, each word deliberate. Gates' face flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You're out of line," he snarled, slamming the gavel. "Sit down, counselor, or I'll hold you." In contempt, she didn't sit. She stood there unyielding, the air electric. "I'm not the one out of line," she said softly, letting the implication hang. The judge's mask slipped, just for a second, revealing something raw, something personal. Bondi saw it, and she knew. Gates wasn't just biased, he was involved. The game had changed. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, every breath heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. Pam Bondi paced before the witness stand, her movements deliberate, a predator circling its mark. Judge Gates sat rigid, his earlier arrogance, now tinged with something darker, a flicker of unease he couldn't quite hide. The gallery sensed it too, their whispers rising like a tide, drawn to the clash between the prosecutor and the man who'd tried to break her. Bondi called her next. Witness, a whistleblower named Kyle Renner, a former aide to Grayson. Renner shuffled to the stand, his face pale, his tie askew. "Mr. Renner," Bondi began, her voice steady, "what did you hear Victor Grayson say about this case?" Renner licked his lips, glancing at Grayson, then away. "He said he had it handled, that the judge was in his pocket." The room exploded in gasps. Grayson bolted upright, his chair scraping the floor. "That's a lie," he shouted, his attorney tugging him back down. Bondi didn't flinch, her eyes on Renner. "Did he name the judge?" she pressed. Renner hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, he said Gates would bury it, called him Shadow." Shadow. The word hit like a gunshot. The gallery erupted, voices overlapping in shock. Bondi turned to Gates, whose face had gone ashen, his gavel frozen mid-air. "Your Honor," she said, her tone calm but lethal. "That's the second time that name's come up today." Gates slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing. "Order!" he roared, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Bondi stepped closer, undeterred. "Mr. Renner, did Grayson ever meet with Judge Gates?" Renner nodded again, quieter now. "Once, Late at night at Grayson's office. I saw them through the window. The gallery buzzed louder, the jury exchanging stunned glances. Bondi held up a photo, a blurry image of two figures in a dimly lit office. Is this what you saw? Renner squinted, then whispered, Yes. Gates' composure shattered. This is outrageous, he bellowed, standing so fast his chair tipped back. You're turning my courtroom into a circus, counselor. Bondi met his fury head-on. No, Your Honor, I'm exposing the truth, something you seem desperate to avoid. The words were a spark to dry tinder. Gates pointed a trembling finger at her. You're finished, Bondi. I'll have you disbarred for this. The threat hung heavy, but Bondi didn't waver. You don't scare me, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The evidence does the talking, and it's screaming. Right now. The gallery fell silent, every eye on the showdown. Gates' chest heaved, his control slipping. You've got nothing, he spat, but it sounded hollow, desperate. Bondi reached into her briefcase, pulling out a small recorder. Then let's hear it for ourselves, she said, pressing play. A grainy voice filled the room, unmistakably Grayson's. Gates'll kill this. He owes me. Shadow's got my back. Then Gates' voice, low and smug. Consider it done. Victor, just keep it quiet. The recording clicked off, leaving a void of stunned silence. Grayson's face drained of color, his attorney frozen beside him. The jury stared, mouths agape. Bondi turned to Gates, her gaze unyielding. Care to explain that, Your Honor? Gates stumbled back, his hands gripping the bench. This is a setup, he stammered. Fabricated, inadmissible. But the room knew better. The truth was out, raw and undeniable. Bondi stood tall, the weight of her victory settling in. The only thing fabricated here, she said, is the justice you've been selling. Gates's eyes darted, wild with panic, as the gallery erupted again, the sound swallowing his protests. The hunter had become the hunted, and Bondi wasn't done yet. The courtroom was a cauldron of chaos, the recorder's echoes still reverberating off the walls. Pam Bondi stood motionless, the device in her hand a smoking gun, its weight far greater than its size. Judge Gates gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white, his breaths shallow and ragged. The gallery roared, a mix of outrage and disbelief, while the jury sat wide-eyed, their faith in the system unraveling before them. Victor Grayson slumped in his seat, his empire crumbling with every passing second. Bondi's voice cut through, the din, calm but unyielding. Your Honor, that recording was obtained legally, a wiretap authorized by a federal judge, not you, obviously. The dig landed hard, and Gates flinched. It proves collusion, corruption at the highest level, and it's just the beginning. She turned to the gallery, her eyes fierce. This isn't about one man, it's about a system that's been bought and sold. Gates pounded his gavel, the sound desperate now. Silence, he shouted, but his authority was a ghost, fading fast. This is my courtroom, you don't dictate here. Bondi stepped forward, fearless. Not anymore, she said, her words ablade. You've disgraced this bench, and that recording ties you to Grayson's crimes. The judge's face twisted, a mask of fury and fear. You're bluffing, he hissed. That tape means nothing, it's hearsay. Bondi didn't blink. The FBI doesn't think so, she replied, nodding toward the back of the room. Two agents in dark suits pushed through the crowd, their badges glinting under. The lights! The gallery parted, breathless, as they approached the bench. Howard Gates, the lead agent said, his voice flat. You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The room exploded again, shouts and gasps blending into a wall of sound. Gates stumbled back, his robe tangling around him. This is absurd, he cried. I'm a judge. You can't touch me. But the agent grabbed his arm, firm and unrelenting. Bondi watched, her expression unreadable, A storm of emotions locked beneath her calm exterior. She dreamed of this moment, not out of spite, but for the people Grayson and Gates had crushed, the families like Maria Torres, the whistleblowers like Renner. The handcuffs clicked around Gates's wrists, a sound sharper than any gavel. He glared at Bondi, his eyes burning with hate. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, as the agents dragged him down. She met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Your Honor," she said softly. "You will." The gallery cheered, a raw, ragged sound of triumph, as Gates was hauled through the side door, his shouts fading into the hall. Grayson's attorney scrambled to his feet, stammering objections, but it was too late. The tide had turned, and Bondi stood at its helm. The bailiff, a burly man with a stunned expression, stepped forward. "Court's recessed," he announced, his voice shaky. The gavel lay abandoned on the bench, a relic of a fallen reign. Bondi gathered her files, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She'd won this round, but she knew the war wasn't over. Grayson still sat there, pale and silent, his fate hanging by a thread. As the crowd dispersed, a reporter shoved a microphone in her face. "Ms. Bondi, what's next?" She paused, her eyes distant but resolute. "Justice," she said simply, "for everyone they've hurt." The camera flashed, capturing the moment, but Bondi was already moving, her mind on the next fight. Gates was down, but the corruption ran deeper, and she wouldn't stop until it was uprooted, root and stem. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Judge Gates, the echo of his arrest still ringing in the air. Pam Bondi stood alone at the prosecution table, the weight of the moment settling over her like a mantle. The gallery buzzed with a frenetic energy, spectators spilling into the halls, their voices a chorus of shock and vindication. Victor Grayson remained at the defense table, his once imposing figure diminished, his hands clasped tightly as if to hold himself together. His attorney whispered furiously beside him, but Grayson's eyes were fixed on Bondi, a mix of fear and fury simmering beneath his silence. The bailiff returned, his face flushed from the chaos. "We're bringing in Judge Linda Carver to take over," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. The crowd quieted, anticipation crackling anew. Carver was known for her no-nonsense rulings, a stark contrast to Gates's crooked tenure. Bondi allowed herself a small breath of relief, the first crack in her iron resolve. She'd cleared one hurdle, but the race was far from over. Judge Carver entered, her gray hair pulled back, her expression stern but fair. She took the bench, her gaze sweeping the room. "I've been briefed," she said, her tone clipped. "Ms. Bondi, you may proceed." Bondi nodded, stepping forward, her files reorganized, her focus razor-sharp. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "With Gates removed, I'd like to revisit the evidence he suppressed." Carver raised an eyebrow but waved her on. Bondi turned to Grayson, her stare piercing. "The defendant's corruption didn't end with bribes," she began. "It extended to intimidation, coercion, even threats against witnesses." She called Maria Torres back to the stand. Torres walked up, her steps surer now, bolstered by Gates's fall. "Ms. Torres," Bondi asked, "did anyone try to silence you?" Torres nodded, her voice firm. "A man came to my house, said if I talked, my kids would suffer. He mentioned Grayson by name." The gallery gasped, a fresh wave of outrage swelling. Bondi handed Carver a police report corroborating the threat, her movements precise. "This is what they feared," she said. "The truth coming out, unfiltered." Grayson's attorney leapt up. "Objection! This is hearsay, uncorroborated." But Carver shut him down. "Overruled," she said, her tone final. "I want to hear it all. Every detail Gates buried." Bondi pressed on, calling Renner again, who detailed late-night calls warning him to disappear. "They knew I'd seen too much," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The jury leaned forward, their faces a mix of horror and determination. Bondi laid out more evidence: wire transfers, burner phone logs, a tapestry of guilt woven tight. Grayson's composure cracked, his hands shaking as he whispered to his attorney. Bondi caught it, a flicker of desperation, and seized it. "Mr. Grayson," she said, turning to him, "your empire's falling and no one's left to prop it up." Carver watched, her expression unreadable but attentive. Bondi felt the shift, the power tilting in her favor. She closed with a final blow, a video from a hidden camera showing Grayson's goons trashing a whistleblower's car. The screen flickered, the sound of shattering glass filling the room. The jury gasped, one juror covering her mouth. Grayson sank lower, his defiance extinguished. "Enough," Carver said, her voice cutting through. "This court will reconvene tomorrow. I need time to review everything Gates tainted." She banged the gavel, a clean, decisive sound. Bondi gathered her things, her heart pounding with quiet triumph. She'd turned the tide, but the real victory lay ahead, in the justice she'd fight for next.